So before you start investigating the hobby of baking sourdough, you will need approximately $362.06 and understand that you're basically adopting a very small pet that needs to be fed regularly. Oh, and you also need to have one day a week at home to babysit your bread baking endeavors. So if you're here for the recipe, go ahead and jump to this time code. But if you want to get started with the whole process, why don't we revisit that $362.06. When I started baking sourdough in 2023, I thought I was going to be smarter than hundreds of years of modern bread baking technique. I thought I could skip out on things like a banneton, a bench scraper, bread flour, and get really good results. And in my attempts to save money by using all-purpose flour, I'd pull my loaf out of the oven and get mad that it didn't work. And when I finally decided to buy the things that other YouTube bakers were suggesting, my results improved. So I'm going to straight up claim that if you cut corners on sourdough as a beginner without years of practice, your bread is likely going to be underproofed, dense, and maybe a little less sour than you hoped. So, with all of that out of the way, let's start with the things that you need for a good home sourdough. Number 1, bread flour. With 12.5% protein content or greater, I recommend King Arthur bread flour. Number 2, a big bowl. I use these Pyrex glass containers that I just happen to have. Number 3, a food scale. Measure your stuff. You can eyeball it, but it will be harder to get the ratios correct, especially as a beginner. So, food scales. Number 4, rice flour. Use this to make sure your dough doesn't stick to the cloth when it's rising. If you use a wheat-based flour, it will glue the cloth to your dough and make it impossible to remove the dough from the proofing bowl or basket. Number 5, a banneton. You can use a bowl with a rice-floured towel, but it's easier because the bannetons and cloths are shaped to fit each other, so I like bannetons and banneton liners. They just make life easy. Number 6, a lame or a super sharp knife. This is the blade that you use to slice the dough before you bake it. Some people make very pretty patterns on their doughs, and while it does look cool, it does have a function that you should not skip. When bread bakes, it expands in the oven, and the dough will expand towards the part of the dough that has the weakest structure. So when you slice the dough before baking, you're basically encouraging the direction of the expansion. Lames are sharper than the random paring knife that lives in your kitchen drawer, so I recommend getting one of these for your sourdough endeavors. Number 7, a large combo cooker. This big hunk of a pan seems a bit excessive, especially if you already have a Dutch oven. Unfortunately, the high heats of a sourdough bake is likely to degrade the enamel of your super expensive pot. So the large combo cooker is a cast iron hunk of metal that's basically indestructible should you clean it and season it properly. I bake my sourdough exclusively in this pot. Number 8, a bench scraper. While it's not as important as the other things because you can do most tasks with your hands, it will be a lot easier to handle your dough because you can slide the thin edge of your bench scraper under your dough and move your boules easily without breaking the shape of your dough. Plus, bench scrapers have a lot of other kitchen utilities, so I like these a lot. Highly recommend. In the description down below, there's a spreadsheet to unaffiliated links to all the stuff that I use for my sourdough. And if you don't like what I use, I recommend scrolling to the suggested alternatives on the Amazon pages. You may see a few other things throughout the rest of this video. They aren't as necessary, but it can make the process a little bit easier, especially for beginners. You may see them here, but most of the important stuff is in the spreadsheet there. As for the recipe, you'll find a ton of YouTubers posting content about sourdough. And if you're mildly internet literate, you'll know not to trust everything on the internet. Unfortunately, a lot of things can affect sourdough beyond the recipe, such as temperature of your kitchen, how active your starter is, humidity, etc. So instead of thinking about a recipe, it's better to think about sourdough as a series of phases where you might have to adapt just a little bit based on what your dough is doing and how it's behaving. Bear in mind, when you think about baking sourdough, plan to be home all day. You'll need to check on it pretty frequently throughout the process, and forgetting about it can lead to flattened, dense bread. Okay, with all that out of the way, why don't we actually jump into my recipe for home sourdough. Phase 1, feeding and autolyse. Start by feeding your sourdough starter about 6 hours before you start mixing your dough. You want it to be active and bubbly before mixing it with your primary bread flour. Depending on how old your starter is or how recently you fed it, you may need to give it more time. What I typically do is I feed it as much flour as there currently is starter the night before, and in the morning it should be ready to go. About 2 to 4 hours before you plan on mixing your starter, mix 900 grams of total weight of flour and 600 grams of water. The total weight is important because that influences how hydrated your dough is. You can do a combination of flours, and many online recipes call for around 90% bread flour and 10% alternate flours like whole wheat or rye flour. This will affect the texture of your dough, and I found that adding wheat flour gives a slightly tighter crumb, and that helps for getting less holes, which means you can spread butter on it without it landing in your lap. Details aside, you're going to take all of your bread flour, the 900 grams, and mix it with your water into a shaggy dough, basically until all the dry flour is absorbed. This step is called autolyse, and it's a super complex, sciencey thing that helps strengthen the dough. For the best results, you want to keep your dough and your starter at roughly 73 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Fancy people with a lot of counter space will use a big proofing box, but I'm not one of those people. So what I do is I turn my oven on for about 30 seconds and then I turn it off. And the residual heat from the oven booting up will bring the ambient temperature up inside the oven, and then also therein bring up the temperature of my dough just a little bit. I sometimes also leave it outside during the summer if I'm baking during the summer and I don't want to keep turning my oven on and off. Temperature is important here because bacteria is more active at moderate temperatures. If your dough gets too warm, it may rise a bit faster than you want. With all that said, let your starter and your autolyse dough rest in a warm environment for about 2 hours. Phase 2, mixing the dough. We need to mix the starter and the autolyse dough, flour, water mixture together into a single homogeneous mass. During the mixing stage, you will take your autolyse dough, your starter, 18 grams of salt, and 60 additional grams of water and mix it together in the bowl. Now, when it comes to mixing your dough, some YouTubers have various techniques and methods that are more legitimate or professional, and this includes the slap and fold method or the rhubarb method. You see, I'm lazy and I don't want to clean my counter or this cutting board because it's like 10 pounds, so I do all my mixing in the bowl. It's basically the rhubarb method where I try and mimic the movement of a stand mixer, and ultimately my goal is to mix the dough exclusively in the bowl so I don't have to clean my countertops or this big cutting board. Feel free to look up and try the other methods I mentioned, but you ultimately want to combine the dough until it's a single sticky, homogeneous, wet mess. Once I start mixing all of my salt, my starter, my autolyse together, I'll start a 30-minute timer, and it'll take me about 10 to 15 minutes to actually mix everything together. The remaining time in that timer is a reminder for my first stretch and fold, which brings us to the next phase. Alexa, 15-minute timer. Phase 3, bulk fermentation. This is where most people make the mistake of not considering temperature as an ingredient. For this recipe or most sourdough recipes, your dough should rest for a total of about 4 hours at 76 degrees Fahrenheit or 25 degrees Celsius for my friends who use the metric system. Most recipes say 3 to 5 hours and suggest room temperature, but I find the broad recommendations to give beginners worse results without mentioning an actual target to look for. Ultimately, you're looking for your dough to expand about 75% more than its original volume during this 4-hour bulk fermentation process. But we're not just going to let it sit there. We have a couple things we need to do. You may have heard the term stretch and folds in your own sourdough research. This is where we do our stretch and folds during the bulk fermentation process, and it's basically where we stretch and fold our dough to help develop gluten or the stretchiness. To do it, first you're going to soak your hand under running water, and basically a wet hand will help prevent the dough from sticking to your fingertips. There is a technique and skill component to this, and it will take some practice, but here's my technique. Stand in front of the dough and at the 1 o'clock position, slip your fingers under the dough and move it to the 12 o'clock position. You're going to gently grip and tug the dough upwards as high as the dough will let you without creating significant tearing and holes. You're going to pull the dough towards you at the 6 o'clock position and fold the dough on top of itself. Then what you're going to do is rotate the bowl 90 degrees and perform another stretch and fold, and then 90 degrees, another stretch and fold, and then one more time until you've done it a 360 degree turn. Sometimes during this stage, I'll flip the dough over so that the bottom side is now on the top side, and that just makes my soul happy. But the big thing you want to avoid is putting a lot of pressure on your dough, which would close the air bubbles that have been expanding throughout the bulk fermentation process. During bulk fermentation, you will need to do 6 instances of stretch and folds. The first 4 you're going to do in 15-minute increments. So you do a stretch and fold, then wait 15 minutes, and do that for the first hour. Then you'll do 2 stretch and folds in 30-minute increments for the second hour. And then in total, you should have performed a total of 6 stretch and folds during the bulk fermentation process. I will 100% confess that I've been caught in meetings sometimes during my bakes, and I've let my stretch and fold timer go a bit longer than it should have. When that happens, I just move along as planned and pick up where I left off. If that happens to you, just set an appropriate timer for the next stretch and fold until you hit a total of 6 stretch and folds within your 4-hour bulk fermentation time. At a total of 4 hours of bulk fermentation, your dough should ideally be about 78 degrees Fahrenheit or 25 degrees Celsius. Plus or minus 2 degrees is normally fine, and anything greater than that may have caused a slightly less desirable proof. Trust me, it will still taste good. You might just have some weird tunneling or holes when you cut into it. Remember that this is not the last time you will make bread, so it's worth getting better with practice and moving on to the pre-shaping phase. Phase 4, pre-shape. To get your dough ready for baking, you need to pre-shape it into its final form. Grab your banneton, liners, and rice flour. What you're gonna do is flip your bowl of dough upside down as best you can and use a flexible bench scraper to gently unstick it from the inside of your bowl onto some kind of work surface. I use this cutting board. You're gonna let it rest and dry out for about 10 to 15 minutes, and during that time, I will prepare my bannetons by putting the liner on the inside and liberally dusting it with rice flour. Say it with me now. We are going to use rice flour. If you use a glutinous flour like wheat or all-purpose bread flour, etc., you're likely to get some dough stickage and be thoroughly disappointed. So basically, use rice flour. Once your liners are prepped, you can come back to your dough, and I recommend cutting it in half with a stiff bench scraper. If you can, try and avoid maintaining any physical contact with your dough for no more than a few seconds because it will basically cling to whatever it's touching. Your dough is fragile at this stage, but if you did everything right, it should have enough gluten to stay in a single mass. Again, different flours and different amounts of water will affect how workable your dough is at this stage. So just do your best to separate your dough into 2 pieces and roughly shape it into a smooth bowl by running your bench scraper underneath the dough until the top of it elastically stretches and you get a nice smooth top surface. My technique typically involves using the bench scraper to move the dough around my work surface so that I can really help shape it without actually putting pressure on it. Again, this will take practice, so find what works for you and just get better at it over time. After you've done some pre-shaping so that the top of your dough is smooth, liberally dust the top of it with flour and with a softly cupped hand, evenly distribute the flour so that the dough doesn't stick to your hand or work surface. From there, get ready to move fast because this is the hard part. You're going to take the dough and flip it so that it's flour side downwards. You're going to take the 2 o'clock position and fold it towards the 8 o'clock position. Then the 10 o'clock position and pull it towards the 4 o'clock position. And gently press the dough into itself so that it sticks to itself. Finally, you're going to rotate your dough another 90 degrees and gently roll it onto itself without pressing too firmly so that the flour side is up. Then you're going to take your bench scraper and run it along the underside and rotate it away from you. And then you're going to take your bench scraper and then pull it towards you. Your goal here is to try and close the seam under your bowl of dough and try and give the dough a cute little butt. With your banneton at the ready, you're going to slip your bench scraper under your dough and then flip the dough over into your opposite hand. Then you're going to lift gently with both hands and nestle your dough into your rice floured banneton. And you can stop panicking. That's the hardest, fastest part. You're going to do all the same steps for your second bowl, and once all that's done, you can wrap your dough in a plastic bag or a very loosely tented kitchen towel so that nothing is in contact with your dough. From here, you can go ahead and throw them in the fridge or gently put them in the fridge overnight and wait until the next morning. Phase 5, cold retardation. Placing your dough in a cold environment will help slow down the fermentation process and reduce yeast activity. This gives the dough more time to ferment, which can help impart flavor. What you're trying to do is just basically leave your dough in the fridge for 10 to 14 hours. I've seen some posts online about leaving your sourdough to bulk ferment in the fridge for 24 to 48 hours, and on average, I've seen more failed sourdough posts with this long fermentation as part of their recipe. So I typically stick with a single overnight fermentation. Now, if you're trying to do everything the same day, some recipes recommend letting it go for 1 to 3 hours at room temperature in the banneton. Almost every article I've read on this suggests that it leads to a worse flavor, and in my experience, those breads also don't spring up as much, so I always do the fridge bulk fermentation overnight. So with all that said, just go to bed and do the bake tomorrow. Phase 6, bake. Baking. Do the baking things. The next morning, as soon as you wake up, place a heavy-duty Dutch oven or Lodge combo cooker in your oven at 500 degrees and let it preheat for an hour. It's also worth prepping your work surface at this point, so collect your rice flour, your lame, and your dusting brush. When your oven is preheated and your Dutch oven is dangerously hot, do not touch with bare hands. Remove the pot and place it on a trivet or a super heat-resistant surface, not like this wood thing. I don't even know if the countertop would work. Basically, heat-resistant surface for your big metal pot. Dust the metal surface with rice flour and brush it around evenly. For a little extra safety, I also place a small piece of parchment paper that I typically use for making burgers at home, and that just helps prevent the dough from sticking to the superheated metal. Once your pot is prepped, go ahead and remove the sourdough from the fridge and release it from its plastic prison. For extra added security and avoiding stickage, I dust a little bit more rice flour on the bottom and brush it with my brush evenly along the edges. From here, again, this is another hard part, you're going to carefully tip over the banneton so that the boule falls into your pot without touching the pot. I will add that I have a couple burn marks here and there. They've healed thus far, but be very careful. That's what I'm trying to say. Once your dough is in the pot, you're going to take your lame or a super sharp knife and score the outside. If you don't do this, your bread will expand unevenly and you'll get some weird tearing. Your instincts are going to encourage you to use a gentle hand, but that is far from the truth. Give your dough a deep incision, about 1 inch to 1.5 inches deep. Just don't cut straight through it. At this point, you're ready to put your sourdough in the oven, but before putting the lid on, I always take 2 ice cubes and put it on either side of my dough and drop it in. You'll know that your pot is hot enough if they start sizzling immediately. This is personal preference and you don't need to do it, but I found some TikToks suggesting it and it helps add more steam to the baking environment, which is why we put the lid on to help trap in moisture during the bake. You don't have to do the ice cubes, but I just do it because I found it helps. Now, from here, equip yourself with your oven mitts. Place the lid on and then take the pot and put it in your oven at 500 degrees and set a 20-minute timer. During that time, go make yourself a cup of coffee, go do your dishes, go do something else. And after 20 minutes, if you're lucky, go ahead and remove the lid and you'll be revealing a very springed loaf that still looks pretty pale and bland. What you're going to do is set the oven down to 465 and let it go for another 15 to 20 minutes. What you're looking for is an internal temperature of 205 to 210 degrees Fahrenheit. It's worth mentioning that all ovens are different. There's a lot of variables that actually affect the results of sourdough. So your oven may be too hot, too cold, the starter may not have been as active, and this is a long process and a long journey. So I hope that you're going to try doing sourdough more than once. With that being said, this is what my sourdough looked like for my first bake, and it still tasted good, it just didn't look as good. This is something that gets better with practice and repetition, just like anything else in life. So all that being said, I hope your first sourdough looks good and looks maybe something like this. I'm always trying to improve, but I hope yours looks good. I'm sure it'll probably taste good at least. But if this is your first sourdough or just every sourdough in between, I recommend taking a picture because you have to wait 2 to 3 hours before you cut into it to really enjoy this bread. How's it?
Good.
Does it pass?
Very tasty.
Does it pass the boyfriend-girlfriend test?
Mm-hmm.
Sweet. Or I guess the girlfriend test. How would you rate it on a scale of 1 to 10?
Gone.
Gone? Sweet. I'll take it. Phase 7, the starter. You may be wondering why I saved the starter until the end of the video. Truthfully, you only need to do the starter once. And also, you might be able to find friends, family, or even a local bakery that would be willing to sell you a bit of their starter. I'll be honest, my first successful starter was after the second attempt. I'm using a recipe from a Mr. Paul Hollywood, and it involved taking flour, water, and a peeled shredded apple. I did the process of letting it sit for 2 days before discarding it and feeding it. My first attempt, it did mold after about a week. But I did try again, and after about 2 weeks, I had a starter that was ready to go. When I finally had a successful starter, I did decide to name it, and for those of you who care, I named my starter the Horde, as in if you do choose to make your own starter, other recipes do call for just flour, water, and a bit of time. What I recommend you do first is ask around your immediate family or local bakeries to see if you can find a starter to give this a shot. After you acquire a starter, you must treat it with respect and very much like a pet. If you keep it on the counter, feed it 3 to 4 times a week, and if you bake less frequently, store it in the fridge and feed it 2 to 3 times per week. I'm gonna be honest, I leave my starter in the fridge and I only feed it once a week and I bake once a week. So it's been fine, and just do some experimentation and make sure there's not mold on it. So if you made it to this point of the video, you may be thinking about ways you can make the process better, faster, cheaper, etc. If you're just getting started, please, for the love of God, understand that if you compromise or change anything, you may get worse results than whatever the recipe suggested, regardless of it being my recipe or someone else's. When I baked my first sourdough loaves, it was less than stellar because I felt I was being smarter than hundreds of years of human sourdough baking technique. So with all that being said, respect your bread. I hope you enjoyed this video and your sourdough turns out great and amazing. We don't even buy bread at the grocery store anymore because I found that I can make it better than whatever I can find at the grocery store. So I hope you embark on the sourdough journey, and I will leave it here. If this video was helpful in getting you started with sourdough or just entertaining, the comment section is down there, so you can let me know about anything. If you have questions, comments, concerns, anything, that's what the comment section is for as well. Until next time, I will leave you with the final tip, and that is to eat 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, and you make some. Goodbye, my friends. Go eat your protein and some sourdough. Bye. Bye, 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 bye.
Let's do this.
Morning hug, here you go.
6 stars.
Hey.
10 stars.
Oh my goodness.
Good bread?
Mm-hmm. Very good.
This is not your dinner, it's your breakfast.
Mm-hmm.
Sweet. Good thing?
Yeah.
Any notes? Feedback?
Very tasty.
Roast me.